Welcome everyone to our very first Salisbury Forum webinar. Please increase the volume of your computer or mobile device to make sure that you're able to hear Professor Tallamy's presentation. Because of the number of our participants, your microphone is muted and your video is turned off, so we won't be able to see you. During Professor Tallamy's talk, if you want to ask a question, there's a small Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You click on that and ask a question to type in your question. And then those will be visible on my screen. At the end of his presentation, during the Q&A, I'll read as many of your questions as possible and he'll be able to answer them. We're very pleased to have Professor Douglas Tallamy with us this evening. He's taught insect-related courses at the University of Delaware for 40 years. He's authored over 100 research papers, and he also is an excellent photographer, as you'll see. He's published a number of best-selling books, and which you'll be able to buy at Oblong Books and Music at your convenience. So with that, I would like to welcome Professor Tallamy to our Salisbury Forum.
Thank you, Mary. Let me screen share. Okay, we're going to talk about nature's best hope tonight, but before we do that, I want to talk about acorns. If you recall this last fall from New Hampshire all the way down to Georgia and west to the Mississippi, a little bit beyond, it was a giant mast year for red oaks. All the red oaks got together, I guess at the National Red Oak meeting, and they decided they would make their acorns at the same time. That's what a mast is, and this is what it looked like in an awful lot of places. Well, if you are easily entertained like I am, maybe you took one of those acorns and put it on a table and just stared at it. And if you stared long enough, maybe you saw a little blemish start to occur on one side of it, and then it started to move, and it was very obvious that something was chewing its way out of that acorn. Turned out to be a larva that seemed bigger than the hole, but out it came, looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy, finally drops to the ground. Very dangerous time for this larva because it's a tasty morsel, very high in protein, very high in fats. It's got to protect itself. So it wiggles and squirms and gets below ground as fast as possible. And that's fast. It's less than 30 seconds to get it below ground, where it stays for 2 years. Actually, it pupates underground and then stays there for 2 years. And after 2 years, out comes an acorn weevil. That's what that larva was. It's an acorn weevil. Now, a lot of people think that these weevils have big noses, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule, and the mouth parts are way down here at the end of this nose. And what they do is they chew a hole down into the center of the acorn, turn around and lay an egg in that hole, and that's how the larva gets down to the center of the acorn, where it has a very safe place to develop. Now you might wonder why they spend 2 years underground. Well, it takes red oak acorns 2 years to develop. So they try to synchronize their life history with the production of those acorns. But of course, after the larva leaves, it leaves a hole in the acorn. And nature is very good at using all kinds of holes. There's a group of specialized ants, the temnothorax ants, a few species that like to live inside the holes that are left in acorns after acorn weevils leave. So if they find a hole that is vacant, they get very excited. And the first thing they do is go back to their disintegrating nest and they will transport everybody, the larvae, the eggs, the queen. They work very hard to get into this new home as soon as possible. And once they're there, here's a little guard. He makes sure nobody else comes in. But now they have a new home that'll last, about 2 years. At this point, my wife says, well, what does this have to do with your talk? What it has to do with my talk is that these type of specialized relationships are what nature is. It's built from millions of these relationships, and they happen right in our yards. So for example, if you want pileated woodpeckers to breed in your yard, you're not going to have them unless you have lots of carpenter ants, because that's what they feed their young. And they get those carpenter ants from the big trees that carpenter ants need. You won't have 13 species of native bees unless you have the pollen of sunflowers. That's unmanipulated sunflowers. Those perennial sunflowers are great because it's the only thing those bees can develop on. You won't have platycodus tree hoppers unless you have oaks, and so on. So nature is a series of very specialized relationships. But today, these relationships and nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we have not listened to what Teddy Roosevelt advised way back in 1908. He got wind of the fact that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, stood on its magnificent lip, looked out over the canyon and said, "Leave it as it is." And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. The problem, of course, is that it's very difficult to leave most areas of the country as they were at this point. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states that's anything close to a pristine ecological state. And you know why. We have logged it repeatedly. We have tilled it. We have drained it. We've grazed it. We've paved it or otherwise developed it. We've straightened our rivers and we've dammed them. And you can spell that any way you want. We've polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents that we call invasive species. They are now displacing the native plants that used to be here exclusively. And actually, this is a good time of year to look at what your invasive species load is because they're the only plants that are green right now. The plants from Asia green up before the plants from North America. So anything that's green out there really doesn't belong here. In essence, we've chopped up the natural world into little fragments of its former self that are too small and too isolated from each other in order to preserve the species that run the ecosystems that support us. We've done this because we thought our nest, planet Earth, was so big that we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we were wrong. And now we're getting headlines on a regular basis that remind us just how wrong we were. This was one of the first. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Followed by, just a few months ago, big study published in Science. North America's lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. And let me remind you what a billion is. 1 million seconds is 12 days. 1 billion seconds is 31.7 years. So 1 billion is a lot. We now have far fewer birds. As a matter of fact, the UN is predicting that we will lose 1 million species, not individuals, but species, possibly in the next 20 years. And they say humans will suffer. Indeed, we will. That is not an option to lose that many species. It simply is not. Well, I could go on about the pox we have delivered upon our environment and thus upon all of our houses. But this is not a talk about that. This is a talk about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that will require small efforts from many people, but those efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to all people. Let's return to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, E.O. Wilson, one of our most famous scientists alive today, professor emeritus at Harvard, just turned 90 this year. Way back in 1987, he told us exactly what it would mean if we lost our insects. Wrote this paper, The Little Things That Run the World, and he very simply said that life as we know it depends on insects. If they were to disappear, so would most of the flowering plants. And if most of the flowering plants disappeared, that would not only change the physical structure of terrestrial habitats, it would essentially end energy flow through those habitats, which would cause the rapid collapse of the food webs that support our animals. The amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, and the mammals, they would all disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth, would essentially rot because we'd lose the insect decomposers that today rapidly turn over nutrients. And of course, humans would not survive any of those changes. The good news is we can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do that. Why do we have to do that? We have to do that because we depend on functioning ecosystems. We are totally dependent on the ecosystem services that ecosystems create. What do plants do for us? Just a few things like produce oxygen, they clean our water, slow its journey to the salty sea. When it rains, that water starts a journey to the sea where we can't really use it. Plants capture carbon, really important ecosystem service these days. And not only do they build their tissues out of it, but they pump that carbon into the ground. The dark layers of our soil, it's carbon that has been put there by plants. Plants build topsoil and hold it in place. If we didn't have any plants, it would be nothing but rock out there. All the soil would be in the ocean. They prevent floods, they dampen severe weather, and on and on. What do animals do for us? Well, they provide pest control services for those plants. They pollinate those plants, as we mentioned. They disperse the seeds of those plants. They form the basis of the food web. So we cannot do without these things. So designing landscapes that destroy the ecosystems, that produce the ecosystem services that we all depend on, really is no longer an option. And we've been doing that for a long time, but can't do it anymore. And some people have recognized this for a number of years. One of the first in the 1900s was Aldo Leopold, considered the father of modern conservation. He said a lot of very important things, but one of the things he said was the oldest task in human history is to live on a piece of land without spoiling it. And we have found that enormously difficult. We certainly vary among cultures. Some cultures are pretty good at living with the land, but most of them, particularly the capitalistic European culture that colonized our North America here, is terrible at doing that. We used to spoil the land and then move to a fresh piece of land and spoil that. There's no place else to go at this point. We have, 8.8 billion people on the planet. There's no place left to go. So we're gonna have to stop all of that spoiling. And Aldo had a dream. He had a dream that we humans could actually develop what he called a land ethic. He realized we have to use the land. We have to farm it and lumber it and graze it and mine it and hunt on it. But we can do those things without destroying local ecosystems. And that's what he called the land ethic. What's curious to me, though, is he never wrote about developing a land ethic where we lived. And I'm not sure why. Perhaps the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist was so deeply embedded in our culture that Aldo didn't really recognize that as an option. Well, I think it is an option. Living with nature is an option. In fact, I will argue tonight that I believe it's the only viable option left to us. So what we need to do now is find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. Those little parks and preserves we have out there are too small and too isolated enough from each other in order to accomplish our conservation goals. So where should we start this process? Anywhere we can, but we cannot ignore privately owned property. 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned. If we ignored those places and only did conservation in those parks and preserves, it would be doomed to failure because, again, they are too small. These are conservation centers or potential conservation centers that have really not been considered seriously in terms of conservation in the past. We have a lot of acreage out there that's part of our vast infrastructure, but they could be landscaped in ways that are a lot more productive. How about power and pipeline rights of ways? How about golf courses, airports? You know, our airports are enormous. The Denver airport is twice the size of Manhattan. How about all the places we live, rural and suburban and exurban landscapes, urban centers, road size? We have 4 million miles of roads, and each one of those paved roads, and each one of those roads has 2 sides to it. Railroad rights of ways. If you add up all of these acres, that's 599 million acres. How big is 599 million acres? Well, it's bigger than Vermont, plus New Jersey, plus Maine, Virginia, New York, Georgia, Florida, Oklahoma, Montana, California, plus Texas, all added up together. So not having a place to improve our existing ecosystems is not the problem. We got plenty of places we can do it. So what we want to do in these lands is we want to renew all parts of nature, the nature that drives our ecosystems. But for now, let's start with the most important species. And by most important species, I'm talking about the species that so many other species depend on. And in terms of building food webs, it's turning out all the research is suggesting that caterpillars are key. We cannot ignore caterpillars. Why? Because they are transferring more energy from plants. Remember, plants capture the energy from the sun. They fix it, turn it into food. Well, it's caterpillars that are passing that energy from the plants to so many other animals on the planet that are not plant eaters. How about birds? Let's look at Carolina chickadees, for example. Many of you have heard these examples in the past, but this is where we have the data, and it's very convincing. They, of course, are seed eaters during the winter, but when they reproduce, they're feeding their young almost exclusively on caterpillars. And it turns out that the chickadees are not exceptions. Most birds are rearing their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. We now actually have data to support that. These are the results of a citizen science project that Ashley Kennedy, my recent PhD student, did. You're looking at 20 families of North American birds. The green bars are the percentage of the nestling diet that is caterpillars. And in 16 of the 20 families, caterpillars dominate the nestling diet. So what would happen to all those birds and all of those families if we lost our caterpillars? Well, if caterpillars are so important, let's ask the question why. What is special about them? We do have a lot of other insects that are out there, but certainly birds and other things are focusing on caterpillars. There are a number of things that are important. One is they're soft. Think of this caterpillar as if it is a sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is cuticle, it's exoskeleton, it's not digestible. So if you're eating a caterpillar, you don't want a lot of cuticle because it's not going to do you any good. And the rest of it is all good stuff. A lot of fat, a lot of protein. And if it's soft, you can stuff it down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring them. And that's not true for a lot of other insects. They're also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized insect is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. And some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They're also very nutritious, as I said, very high in protein, very high in fat, a low percentage of chitin, of exoskeleton, compared to things like beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages, they're like little tanks, and they've got a lot of sharp edges, so they're just not as good a food source. And it turns out the caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids, particularly for birds during the breeding season. Now, I mentioned carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate, and you're a vertebrate. And vertebrates don't make carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids, yet they are essential components of vertebrate diets. So we need them. And that's why my wife Cindy says I should eat my carrots to get my beta carotene, and I should eat my tomatoes to get my lycopene, whatever that is to get my lutein. And she makes sure I eat all of that stuff because they stimulate my immune system. I am generally healthier when I have lots of carotenoids, and these days that's important. They're antioxidants. They run around our bodies and protect our DNA from oxidative damage. They improve color vision. When your mother said, eat your carrots, you will see better. Turns out she was right. She didn't know she was right, but she was. They improve sperm vitality. They improve sexual attractiveness. Now we're talking about particularly male birds. This is a male prothonotary warbler. He is bright yellow because he's had access to lots of luteins, which he takes and makes pigments out of them and puts them in his feathers. And the brighter yellow he is, the more ladies he attracts. So birds are getting their carotenoids not from plants, but from the prey items that they eat. And as you can see, the carotenoid content of bird prey items is not at all equal. The first two bars here are caterpillars, types of caterpillars, and they have by far the most carotenoids, followed by things like crickets and grasshoppers, the orthopterans. Then look at the adult caterpillars. The moths and the butterflies are way down here because moths and butterflies don't eat green leaves. It's their caterpillars that do. Here's the earthworm way over here. The early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. Does that matter in prey choice? Well, this is, again, Ashley Kennedy's study. She looked at bluebirds, put GoPro cameras on the tops of bluebird boxes, which took a picture once every second. And she had a lot of GoPro cameras and she had a lot of bluebird boxes, and she did it for 3 years. So she had more than 1 million pictures to go through. But this is the relationship she found, that the prey items that were taken most frequently, caterpillars, had the largest amount of carotenoids followed by those crickets, and then everybody else is nestled down here. So it does seem that birds, one of the criteria birds are looking for is carotenoid content. And it also suggests that for birds, at least, caterpillars may not be optional parts of the diet. It's looking like they are essential parts of the diet. And that means you can't have any breeding birds, or at least the ones that are insectivores, where there are not enough caterpillars. And that means we have to know how many caterpillars is enough. Having almost enough caterpillars in your landscape isn't good enough. You have to have exactly what the offspring need to reach reproductive maturity, or the reproduction is going to fail. So how many caterpillars does it take to make a clutch of chickadees? Thousands, 6,000 to 9,000, just to get them to the point where they leave the nest. And then the parents continue to feed the babies for another 24 days after they leave the nest. And nobody's counted those because they're flying all over the place. So you're talking about thousands of caterpillars that the chickadees have gathered from within 50 meters of the nest. So if you want them breeding in your yard, you need to have these caterpillars in your yard. So then how do we make landscapes that create caterpillars? That's never been our goal in the past, so we have to think about that. But we don't have to think very hard. We just have to add the caterpillars that make, or we have to add the plants that make caterpillars. And we have to be careful because not all plants do make caterpillars. There is a catch. Most caterpillars are what we call host plant specialists. They can only develop on particular plant lineages. And without those lineages, you don't have those species of caterpillars. So you have to add the plants on which caterpillars have specialized. Why are insect herbivores so specialized? They're specialized because plants defend themselves. They don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their tissues with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves and buds and things either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why it's green out there, or will be shortly. It's not because there are no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat those plants. They are too well protected. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. Most of the insects, and it's about 90%, can only eat the plants with which they share a coevolutionary history, the ones where they have developed specialized adaptations to circumvent all of those defenses. They develop physiological adaptations, the enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, behavioral adaptations, life history adaptations that allow them to eat those plants without dying. But again, it takes a long period of exposure to those plant lineages for all those adaptations to fall into place. It does not happen overnight. All I'm saying here is that plant choice matters. If we're trying to build productive landscapes in our human-dominated landscapes, productive ecosystems, then the choice of the plants that we use is critical. And I'm going to use, I'm going to start with our house. I am sitting right in that window right now. This is what it looked like when we moved in the year 2000. We're on 10 acres in Oxford, Pennsylvania. And the entire area that we bought had been mowed for hay. And actually, this area has been in agriculture for 300 years. So pretty depleted soils. Most of the topsoil is washed down into a ravine over here, starting from scratch. And the area had been out of mowing for 3 years before we actually moved in. So what was there? All the invasive species from Asia. That's my wife, Cindy. She's about ready to tackle this tangle of multiflora rose and oriental bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle and on and on and on. But you know what? She did it. She cleared the 10 acres a little bit at a time. So all of you who say, oh, it's impossible, it's not impossible. You can do it. You just have to stick with it. Well, while she was working hard, I was playing. I love to take pictures of caterpillars. So in order to get those caterpillars at home, I had to pick the plants that produce those caterpillars. I wanted to take a picture of the Canadian owlet, and it's very leaf-like looking adult. So I had to put the only plant that they eat into our yard. It's meadow rue. Well, we didn't have any meadow rue in our yard. There wasn't any meadow rue around us that I knew of. So I got some seeds from someplace and planted them. The meadow rue grew. But really, I thought it would be years before the Canadian owlet discovered meadow rue. Maybe they had to come down from Canada. So I wasn't paying much attention to it. But about 2 months after I planted the meadow rue, I went out and looked. It was defoliated. The Canadian owlet had not only found the meadow rue, but it had found it in spades. And now I have a thriving population of Canadian owlets. Worked really well, really fast. Same story here. I wanted the goldenrod stowaway, that beautiful yellow moth. Its name is a misnomer. It has nothing to do with goldenrod. It is a specialist on this flower, Bidens aristosa. Some people call it ditch daisy. Again, we had no ditch daisy. There was some in a power line about 15 miles away. So I went and got some seed, planted it at home. It took 2 years, I think it was, before the goldenrod stowaway came. But now I have both ditch daisy and goldenrod stowaways. I wanted the hackberry emperor because it ought to be here. But in order to have that, and that's what the adult looks like, you got to have hackberry. We didn't have any, so I planted about 7 hackberries, and now we have a thriving population of hackberry emperors. I did not plant goldenrod. It came on its own, and along with it came many of its 110 species of caterpillars that eat goldenrod, like the brown hooded owlet, the Arsidra flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the goldenrod gall moth, the goldenrod flower moth. This is one that actually has not made it to our property yet. So I'm waiting for it. It's anticipation. It's like waiting for the ketchup to come out. Every year I go out and check my goldenrod, hoping I can find this moth, and it's beautiful caterpillars. Hasn't happened yet, but it will one of these days. We also got the tephritid fly that makes the goldenrod gall, this swelling up here that you see on your goldenrod stems all winter long. This is one reason why you should not cut down your goldenrod stems or any of the other meadow plants in the fall, because inside there is a very juicy morsel, and that is what keeps some of our birds very happy on cold nights. Chickadees know that they're in there. They will plug away. So will the downy woodpeckers, and so will titmice. And this is what the galls look like at this time of year. It's very hard to find a gall that has not been broken into, and that little larva is eaten. And that often makes the difference between chickadee survival on a very cold night or not surviving. I planted Virginia creeper. Yes, I actually planted Virginia creeper. I like that plant. But my goal was to get Pandora sphinx because I like the caterpillar even more than the plant, and I like its adult. They came the first year, put it on my back porch, and it was very successful. But I got things I didn't even know existed. I got the lettered sphinx. I got the hog sphinx. Here's another anticipation. I'm waiting for the Abbott sphinx. Hasn't showed up yet, but it will. Wanted the zebra swallowtail. I think it's the prettiest of the swallowtails, but they are a specialist. That's what its caterpillar looks like. It's a specialist on pawpaw. So we planted pawpaws. Now this didn't happen as fast. We waited 9 years before the swallowtails found our pawpaws. The closest colony I knew of was 26 miles away, but weather conditions right, who knows what happened. They finally found our pawpaws. But in the meantime, we got the pawpaw sphinx. Again, I didn't know there was a pawpaw sphinx, and we got lots of pawpaws. And I planted a lot of oaks. Now, this is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. I want to emphasize that your oaks do not have to be 400 or 500 years old before they actually produce. I wanted to put a slide in here, forgot to do it. I got a picture of a seedling oak. It's about 3 inches tall. First year, put the leaves out, and there's a caterpillar standing on the ground and with its head up eating the leaves of that tree. So they start to support life immediately. And you get things like the solitary oak leaf miner, juvenile's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered slug caterpillar, the orange tufted oneida, the red wash caterpillar, the yellow vested moth, the orange tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red humped oak worm, the orange humped oak worm, the pink striped oak worm, the delightful dagger moth, the pleasant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown bucolatrix, the white blotch heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more will come to the oaks you put on your yard. So this is what our yard looks like now, taken from the same place where I took that original picture. We have put the plants back. We and the blue jays and the squirrels, a lot of things have put the plants back. The big goal now is to keep those invasive species out. But because we have the plants, we have a lot of species of moss that have followed them. I'm counting those moss. I'm up to 940 species of moss that are now on our property. And if we think of each one of those moss species as bird food, got a lot of bird food, and that's why we have had 55 species of bird breed on our 10 acres. So it works. But I know what you're thinking. Can it work in suburbia? What if you don't own 10 acres? You've got a much smaller piece of property. Well, let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. And if we look at their backyard, this is their water feature. They call it a bubbler. And it has been, first of all, their property was loaded with bush honeysuckle. That was about the only thing there. So they got rid of the bush honeysuckle and they planted the native plants. They put in their bubbler and they've been recording the number of species of birds that come to their yard. 149 species so far, 35 warbler species. Just for comparison, we've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house. So the Terpstras are doing really well, and it's on 0.6 acres. And I visited their house. They are surrounded by people who aren't doing this. So that little 0.6 acres in Kirkwood, Missouri is good enough to bring in all of that life. Can it work in urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house, who lives right next to Chicago O'Hare Airport. Well, she did the same thing. She's got a little postage-sized yard, 1/10 of an acre. That's 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. She took out the invasives. She put in 69 species, 60 species of native plants, a water feature. Now she lives 1/2 block from Chicago Kennedy's Expressway. And she really is directly adjacent to one of O'Hare Airport's runways. There's no connectivity between her yard and any other preserved land. And she did all of this, not just on her 1/10 of an acre, but in her backyard. And it was in her backyard because she doesn't have a front yard. Her front yard is a cement slab. Well, she has recorded, this is an old figure now, she's recorded, I think it's 113 species of birds that come by, use her yard, including a woodcock. If you haven't seen a woodcock lately, you can go to Pam's house in Chicago and see one. But what about in the middle of a city, in a city center? Well, in 2014, I was looking at this Asclepias tuberosa, this butterfly weed, which reminds me, we have a marketing issue with our native plants. They're never going to do well as long as we call them all weeds. This is a very good plant. It's one of the milkweeds. We're not going to call it a weed. Let's call it Monarch's Delight. Okay, I was watching Monarch's Delight, and the first thing I saw was this megachilid bee, leafcutter bee. I know it's a megachilid bee because it carries its pollen on its tummy, and it was there sipping nectar on the butterfly weed. And I had not seen this species in a long time. There was another species there that I hadn't seen at all. And the reason the leafcutter bees were there is because they had everything they needed, including very soft leaves. What they do is they chew out the margins of soft leaves that they can roll up. This is a redbud leaf, so there was redbud there. They roll up those leaves and stuff them full of pollen and then stuff it in a crack. So they had the pollen and nectar that they needed. They had the leaves that they needed, and I'm sure they could find a crack someplace. Other bees were there too. There were bumblebees. The redbud, of course, blooms early in the spring. That's what gets those queens going, and lots of other blooming plants. And then I saw a monarch. Actually, I saw 2 monarchs. Now, this was June in 2014. In 2013, I'd gone the entire year without seeing a single monarch. So this was where the monarch population had bottomed out in east of the Rockies. And I was really happy to see it, but this is up where I live. So I was surprised to see it in June. It's hard to get the monarchs up that far that early. So that was exciting. They were there because they had the plant that they need to oviposit on. There were other species of milkweed there as well. So do you know where I was? I was on the High Line in the middle of Manhattan, in the middle of the busy High Line, which attracts millions of tourists each year. And this is the extent of the planning. It's a strip on a converted old elevated railroad tracks. So you don't have a lot of plants there. But it convinced me that if you have thoughtful plantings of the native plants that create the life around us, you can bring life anywhere. If we can do that in the middle of Manhattan, we can certainly do it do it anywhere. Very encouraging trip. Okay, there are 4 keys to success that I want to emphasize. Things that we all need to think about if we're going to succeed. And one of them is we have to shrink the lawn, because lawn is a dead space. I don't know how many acres this is, but there's not much living there. And if there is anything living there, we make sure we kill it with our pesticides and our herbicides, which then immediately wash down into our watersheds. We've got over 40 million acres of lawn in the US, which is the size of New England, all in this dead space. And we do it for aesthetic reasons. I'm suggesting that we cut that area in half. If we replant half of those 40 million acres, we're going to manicure the lawn that we still have, but we're going to put plants back into the other half. And if we do that in the other half, that's 20 million acres of new planted areas. If we do it at home, we can call that homegrown national park. And it'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, the Grand Canyon, Denali, which is huge, and the Great Smoky Mountain. You add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. What are the benefits of building a park at home? There actually are a number of them. One of the things that we're lacking these days is any type of personal relationship with nature. We're totally detached. Most people are totally detached from nature. And it's very important that we rebuild that. We rebuild that at our own pace and at our own time. Because if we don't care about nature, we're certainly not going to try to save it. So you get to do that right where you live. You can avoid crowds. You can avoid expenses. You don't get to take a road trip, but they're not as much fun anymore. All those avoid or travel hassles, all that can be avoided. You simply walk out your door and you're in your own little national park. Plus, you get to experience the natural world alone. When you go to a national park these days, you're there with millions of other people. So you get to see nature with a lot of other people and cars around, and it's not the experience that maybe you were after. Plus, and this may be the most important one, you get to hunt lizards. And I learned that from my granddaughter, Zoe, who sent me this slide. She is hunting lizards seriously. And she pointed out that you have to disguise yourself with leaves and sticks, and you have to crawl very slowly on the ground so the lizards don't see you coming. And you can wear your best dress, that's okay. Now, Zoe lives in Hawaii. And her front yard is about 10 feet by 10 feet. And she doesn't have a backyard at all. So the important thing is here, there really are lizards there, they're little anoles, and she has invented this game. She's interacting with nature in a very tiny space at her own pace, at her own time. And believe me, she will remember hunting lizards in Hawaii the rest of her life. And if you have kids and you're wondering how to entertain them on your new homegrown national park, this is a great book that just came out by Nancy Strinisti, I believe it is, Nature Play at Home. It is chock full of things that you can do with your kids in any natural area near you. So I encourage you to pick that up. Okay, number 2, we need to focus on keystone plants. They turn out to be essential components of any ecosystem. And a keystone plant, it's something we just recently have discovered working in our lab at the University of Delaware. It turns out that only about 5% of our native plants are making about 75% of the caterpillar food that drives the food webs. So without these 5%, you're losing 75% of the food. What I'm saying here is that there are a few native plants that are much better at supporting life than other native plants. So it's not as simple as having natives versus non-natives, because I could build an all native landscape, but if I build it out of the unproductive natives, it wouldn't be much better than a non-native landscape. So the question really is not whether natives are better than non-natives. On average, they are. The question is, do we want ecologically productive plants in our landscapes? Or do we want ecologically benign plants, or even worse, ecologically destructive plants? Those are the choices. That's the choice that we have. I get emails a couple times a year from somebody pointing out that ginkgos from China, Ginkgo Biloba, actually grew in North America 7 million years ago. So then the person goes on and says, so that makes them native, and that means I can plant them and all is great. Well, remember, native is not going to be our metric anymore. The question is, how many caterpillars do ginkgos support? 0. If you're looking for a plant to support the life around it, it's not going to happen with ginkgo. Compared to, how about 462 species of caterpillars supported by oaks in Connecticut? 0 or 462. Let me point out the power of Keystone Oaks in my yard. Now, oaks are one of the things that I have added and added most of them as acorns, so you don't have to spend a lot of money. Well, so far I've recorded that 940 species of moths that I talked about. Of those 940, 823 have known host plants. Excuse me, I need a little drink here. It's water. Okay, 843, we know what they're eating. The others, we don't know what they're eating. So out of the 823, 248 of those species use oaks. And we have 59 genera of native woody plants in our property, only one of which is the genus Quercus, the oaks. In other words, oaks are representing less than 2% of the woody plant diversity in our yard, but they're supporting 30% of our moth species. And maybe more than that, because out of all the ones we don't know what they're eating, some of them surely are eating oaks. That's what a keystone species does. Okay, third important thing that we have to think about is all those lights we have on it at night. Keystone species work really well at creating the life around us unless you have lights on at night, and then they don't work at all. Unfortunately, that was a result of a study we did last summer. And that's because we're calling in the moths to lay on our keystone plants, and then we're killing them at our lights. We still don't know why moths and other insects go to lights. Some people have looked at it for more than 100 years now, and there's some hypotheses, but no good answers. The point is, a trip to a light for an insect typically is a one-way trip. The bats come down and pick them off, or they sit on the side of the wall here in the morning, the birds come pick them off, or they simply exhaust themselves by flying around and around and around, using up limited amount of energy. Now, I know the argument, oh, we have to have lights on for security. Whether or not that is true, put a motion sensor on your security light so that it only turns on when the bad man comes. And the first thing you will discover is how often the bad man does not come. Better yet, if you don't want to deal with a motion sensor, put a yellow light bulb in replace that white light with a yellow light bulb. And the best thing you can replace it with is a yellow LED bulb. Those are almost entirely unattractive to insects. So if we as a country converted to yellow LED bulbs for night lights, instantly we would save billions of insects, and it wouldn't cost very much. Okay, keystone species, what are some of the top genera in our area here? Oaks lead the way in 84% of the counties of the US, certainly in Connecticut. Notice I say native oaks. There are non-native oaks out there. You've had English oak or Quercus sagittarius, the Chinese oak that is, it's also invasive. We have, over 90 species of native oaks. Why we need to go to a non-native oak is beyond me. Same thing with cherries, native willows, native birches. These are all very high producing plants. Aspens, native maples, and then it goes right on down the list. Goldenrods, very high. Asters, those native sunflowers, various species of solanum, believe it or not. Wild strawberry, polygonums, these are all very highly rated plants. How do we know what these are? You go to Native Plant Finder on the National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the ranked list of productive plants for your county will pop up. So, it used to be a valid excuse. We just didn't know what to plant in where we lived, but no longer. Now we do know what to plant. You can find that in a matter of minutes. Okay, the fourth thing we need to consider when we're putting these plants in our yards, trying to restore these ecosystems, is we have to build landscapes that allow the caterpillars we're trying to create to fuel our food webs to complete their life cycle. What do I mean by that? Well, I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania. In Chester County alone, there are 511 species of caterpillars that develop on oaks. A few of them complete their life cycle on the oaks, like this polyphemus moth caterpillar here. It eats the oak leaves, it spins a cocoon and hangs from the oak branches, then it emerges as an adult and will lay its eggs and start all over again. Everything happens on the tree. And I wish all of the insects did that, but they don't. 94% of them drop from the tree. And they pupate in the soil. The soil has to be loose enough, aerated enough so that a caterpillar can dig down in there and form a pupal chamber under the soil. Or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that is under your tree. And you see where I'm going here. There is no leaf litter under our trees, and the ground is mowed and so compacted, very tough for a caterpillar to get down. We've created ecological traps where we draw in insects and don't allow them to complete their life history. So, you know, another reason we're wondering why we got insect decline, we're killing them at every possible opportunity. And of course, the cement option is even less attractive. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't have trees in our cities. We shouldn't have so much cement. Cement as a default landscape, but that's just laziness. And it certainly wrecks our watersheds as well. Now, this is what we typically do. We have our trees and then we have lawn all around them. Nobody's measured caterpillar survivorship in situations like this. I was planning on doing this summer with some undergraduates. I don't know if we'll be allowed to or not, but it'll be an important little experiment. How well do they do in a lawn? But I can guarantee they will do better in a situation like this, where you have your tree, you have your layered landscape. This is a native azalea and your ferns and your ground cover. Here's where you can do your spring ephemeral gardening. It'll be beautiful. You can, you know, spend as much time gardening as you want, but I guarantee you're not going to go tramping through there. You're not going to mow it. You're not going to compact the soil. It'll be a safe site for the caterpillars to fall down and pupate in that situation. Or you can use your ground covers, like wild ginger or mayapple or countless others. And again, safe site for these caterpillars. Another very important point is something we learned recently from the results of my recent PhD student, Desiree Narango, who studied chickadee reproduction in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And that is, there is room for compromise. What she did, I'm boiling 3 years of work down into one little slide here. She looked at the ability of chickadees to successfully reproduce as a function of the plants in the landscape where she put up chickadee boxes. And when the landscape was dominated by introduced plants, they produced 75% fewer caterpillars compared to landscapes dominated by native plants. So right away, you have reduced the amount of chickadee food by 75%. Her nest boxes were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all when they were in a landscape dominated by non-native plants. So the chickadees came, they looked around. Nest holes are in short supply. They always want to use them, but these are probably second-year birds who have experience, and they said, there is not enough food here. There's no way we're gonna successfully reproduce, so we're not even gonna try. If they did try, those nests contained 1.5 fewer eggs. The clutches were 29% less likely to make it to the point where they left the nest at all. They produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to get to the point where they fledged. And the chicks that fledged were lighter than the ones that were in native-dominated landscapes. And you might think, well, those aren't huge differences. But if you put all that together in a population growth model, this is what you get. As a function of the percentage of non-native plants in the landscape. So this dotted line is replacement rate. This is the rate at which the population has to reproduce in order to replace the adults that die every year. So if you breed at this rate, you have a stable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking. That's what sustainable means. If you breed at a higher rate, you actually have a growing population, but if you're below that dotted line, you have a shrinking population, an unsustainable population. Well, those lines overlap right here at around 30% non-native plants. So in other words, if you have 70% of your native plant, of your plant biomass in productive natives, you can have a sustainable breeding bird population. So this 30% becomes the area of compromise. You can have your crepe myrtle. You can have any of those attractive ornamental plants that are not invasive. You can't have your burning bush or those other things. And it won't ruin your landscape because it's balanced by those productive plants. And the more keystone species you have in here, the better off you're going to be. So compromise is good. You know, if I sat here and said, you are not allowed to have any non-native plants at all, the audience would be very small, very small. Can we use native plants in formal designs? Guy sent me this slide not too long ago on email, and I'm terrible at keeping track of names, so I don't even know who it was. But he's one of the guys designing this replica of the Gardens of Versailles, and without telling anybody, he's sneaking in native plants. His goal is to get it to be all native without anybody knowing. And look, he can do it. That's Joe Pyeweed right there. So I'm anxious to see what it looks like when he finishes the conversion. Formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal gardens in Europe all the time. And I guess it's okay because they're non-native plants over there. But can we spruce up this yard with a little bit of native plantings here without it looking wild and messy? Sure, we put a little fence around this planting, all natives here. This is a wonderful little pollinator garden. Be very productive. It's pretty, it's fun, doesn't take up a lot of space, and it shows that we can do it. A little planting like this. Drew Latham sent me this. Instead of just plain lawn, we could put a bunch of these in. Again, great pollinator gardens. I don't know if you know Heather Holm. She's written books on native bees. She sent me these slides the other day. Before and after pictures at her own yard. This is the space beforehand. This is what she did with it when she got rid of some of the pavement and put in some plants. Here's another section here, a barren fence line. This is what it looks like after she reduced the area in lawn and put in a little hedgerow of native plants. So we can do it. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Of course they can. Of course they can. And we're starting to see this. Minnesota has a cost-sharing plan to encourage homeowners to replace lawn with prairie or even parts of lawn. They will help you pay for it. Florida, there's an island in Florida that is paying its residents to allow burrowing owls to burrow in their front lawns. And when a municipality does this, it gives you social permission. So when somebody says, oh, you got a hole in your lawn, I say, hey, I'm helping the owl here. This is a listed species in Florida. And I'm doing the right thing. Missouri offers free replacement. They will replace your tree, your calorie pair. If you pull out the calorie pair, they'll give you a tree to replace it. It's kind of like a bounty. And that's great. Terrible invasive right there. Okay, winding up, we've made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. By the early years, I mean the last century. First of all, we've assumed that nature is important, but it's not essential. It's not essential. I was at the Cincinnati Zoo not long ago, and there's this wall-size poster, saving wildlife for future generations. And you know, I've heard this countless times. The reason we're going to save wildlife is so that future generations can appreciate that. And that certainly is a reason, but it's not the main reason. Wildlife is not just entertainment. We're going to save nature so that we have future generations. How about that? I think that's a more important reason. Second misstep is we've assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. Now, we talked about this. If that is true, we're going to restrict our conservation efforts just to the places where there aren't any humans, those untouched areas, which means we've condemned it to ultimate failure because those areas are too small and too isolated from each other. David Quammen has this analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. This is not 71 Persian rugs. It's 71 fragments that are not functioning as a Persian rug. And that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. And I hate that terminology because it suggests there are places on the planet that have no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including your yard. So what we need to do is put the plants back in your yard, in our public spaces, all these human-dominated landscapes in between these fragments, and glue our Persian rug back together again. And we're going to use those great plants so that this is where we coexist with nature. There's going to be enough here that it's not just a biological corridor where things can move back and forth. They're going to live here. They're going to live here. We're knitting one giant ecosystem back together again. Our third misstep is to leave Earth stewardship just to a few specialists, not seeing that it's an inherent responsibility of everybody on the planet. Every single person on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystems. So why would most people get a pass in terms of being good Earth stewards? can't continue. It doesn't mean that you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you really can. You really should think about saving it where you live. And this approach empowers each one of us. It's one of the things I like the most about it. We've got a number of really serious environmental issues. Climate change is certainly up there. But if I said to you as an individual, I want you to solve climate change tomorrow, or at least I want you to work on it and I want you to see the results, it's not going to happen. You can stop driving your SUV, but you won't see any difference. There's no positive feedback. But here you can go out, you can plant that oak tree, you can plant that birch, you can watch the life come to it. You can rebuild your ecosystem and see that this works. It empowers you as an important piece of the conservation puzzle. And it shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable. Don't think about the entire global environmental issue. It's too depressing. Just worry about the property that you own, or if you don't own any property, the property, the nearest park that you can volunteer in and help manage. That's something we can sink our teeth into. We're going to reduce the area that's in lawn. We're going to get rid of those invasive species. We're going to put in those keystone plants, and that's it. We'll be done. We'll be done. So as property owners, each one of us has the power. We certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. And whether or not we choose to do so is going to determine nature's fate. In other words, you are nature's best hope. And these are my grandkids pointing that out. Thank you very much.
So I have a question from Kathy Chow. It says, our area is carpeted with grass-fed beef and horse pastures and commodity corn, hay, and soybeans. How do these fields fit into the biodiversity big picture? And besides riparian borders, are there farming techniques that will make these open spaces more critter friendly?
Yes. The answer to the first part, what are they contributing? Not much. Particularly you move into the Midwest where we've got corn and soybeans. We've got Roundup Ready products that get rid of all the weeds, most of which are native plants. And because it's so easy to do that now, the growers typically spray right up to the road and they plant grass seed. The grass is, by the way, it's cool season European grass. It's not supporting anything because then they've got to mow it. So they've gotten rid of the hedgerows. They've gotten rid of the milkweed that supports our monarchs and the asters that support the migration and all the flowering plants that support our 4,000 species of native bees. Every time we neaten up with this type of landscaping, it looks nice, but it's deadly to biodiversity. So what can we do to all of these spaces? We can put our hedgerows back. I know we have to think about the giant machinery that we have, but we've gone overboard. We can compromise, we can put our hedgerows back. And if it takes some land out of production, I think that the grower should be compensated. Everybody, as I said, everybody on the planet, let's just focus on the US. Everybody in the US needs ecosystem services. And right now, 82% of us live in cities and think, well, wait, I don't have to worry about that. Somebody else will worry about that. Well, you're using those ecosystem services as much as if you owned property. So I think we should have a pay-per-use fee. We won't call it a tax, but every time you use the earth, you got to pay for it. Let's just make it simple. How about $10 a year? That would generate what, $3.3 billion a year that we could use for environmental issues. It's one trip to Starbucks, nobody would notice it, but you could compensate the grower for putting in pollinator strips and preventing nutrient runoff and that gets into the Mississippi and then down creates a dead zone in the Gulf. So I'm rambling, so I will stop there, but I think I answered the question.
Okay, well, I think this relates to a lot of people in our area. Peter Reed asks, the deer population is burgeoning in our area. Are they a threat to native plants? What advice do you have for what we should plant?
Yes, indeed, they're a threat to native plants because they eat them. They prefer native plants. One of the reasons we have such a problem with invasive species like bush honeysuckle and burning bush and autumn olive is because the deer won't eat them. They don't like them. they're just like the insects. They prefer the young oaks and all the young trees, the young maples, and that's what they live off of. So it tips the competitive balance against our native plants and favors these invasive species. So a lot of people say, well, I will put in plants that the deer won't eat. The problem is most of those plants don't support insects either. Things like spicebush, deer don't like spicebush. And that's why we got a lot of spicebush. But spicebush is very low on the list of the things that it will support. We need to have the powerhouse plants in there, even though the deer like them. So the real solution is to have fewer deer. And that would solve a number of problems, from Lyme disease to clobbering our ground nesting breeding birds, to the fact that our forests are not being, there's no recruitment in the forest because the deer eat all the young trees, and on and on. And it would be healthier for the deer as well.
Okay, I'm planning to establish, this is a question from Deb Brickner. I'm planning to establish native plants on our farm. I have local native seeds and also red clover. Can I broadcast the seeds on the surface of grass, or do I need to till the area and plant the seeds? I have an acre I plan to convert to native.
Yeah, grass is a really competitive plant. It's got a very dense root system. They're not very deep, but if you just throw seeds out on top of it, you probably will get almost nothing. Those seeds need mineral soil to germinate. They need a disturbed area. And this becomes a major challenge. How do we reduce the amount of grass? There are a lot of people that want to do it without using any herbicide. And if it's a smaller area, you can put black plastic on it for months or years, and it will eventually kill the grass. Grass is just really, really competitive. So professionals that are putting in a meadow would come in and they would herbicide the grass and then start from scratch. Another thing you could do, an acre is a big place, but plugs, of course, are more competitive. So you can put in plugs if you can afford it, and that will get these plants going. The grass grows, it covers up these young plants though, so it is very difficult to do without getting rid of the grass.
Okay, Kelly and Kellner, most hairless caterpillars are shown in the beaks of the bird pictures. Hairy tent caterpillars, for instance, don't seem to have value for our native birds. Is that correct?
You are very observant. It is true. Most birds don't like hairy caterpillars. The hairs become dislodged and get stuck in their esophagus and their stomach. And that is why we have hairy caterpillars. It's a very good defense against bird predation. There are birds that specialize on hairy caterpillars, though. The cuckoos are one of them, the yellow-bill and black-bill cuckoo. And they will follow outbreaks of tent caterpillar and fall webworm and even gypsy moth and eat those caterpillars almost exclusively, because they have the ability to slough off the lining of their esophagus and their stomach periodically and get rid of all of those hairs. But we never have enough cuckoos around to control those things. So yes, hairy caterpillars are well protected from most birds.
Okay, from Maureen Earls, how do you get rid of the hayfield to plant the native plants? Meaning, how do you kill the grass? Did you do large areas at a time or smaller plots?
It depends on your resources. Doing any large area, doing anything in it is going to be a much bigger deal. You can start smaller areas, but it's pretty similar to the other question. You have to beat down that grass and give the plants you're putting in there a competitive advantage. Now, if you're not putting in a meadow, if you're putting in woody plants, that's much easier, because you can plant a tree right into grass, and you got to protect it from the deer. I use metal cages until the plant is big enough. But the trees can outcompete the grass, and then pretty soon they start to shade it out. So most of what we've done on our property is put in woody plants. Actually put in so many that I want to open up some sunny areas now, because you'd be surprised how fast these plants grow. And I'm getting a little too shaded out. But the easiest thing to do is plant a tree, and you could reclaim an acre very, very quickly that way.
Okay, from Barbara Maltby. When is the best time to mow a field in order to keep down invasives, but not interfere with the native plants like goldenrod and milkweed?
Well, the native plant, you can mow. First of all, I would mow in March. I would mow as soon as the snow is gone, if we ever get snow again. I guess you get snow up there, we didn't. And you get your mower out there. Don't mow in the fall because those plants are providing seed and overwintering sites for seed for the birds and overwintering sites for a lot of the insects. The problem with mowing everything at once is wherever you mow or wherever you burn, you are killing everything that was in those dead stalks. And that includes a lot of overwintering bees and the eggs from a lot of the orthopterans. So what's recommended is typically to mow a third of your property, your field. So one year you mow a third and 2/3 are not mowed. And then the next year you mow another third, a different third, so that any one section of your field is only mowed once every 3 years. Then the place you didn't mow will be the source that will recolonize, provide organisms to recolonize the area that you did mow or you did burn. Mowing temporarily controls invasives, but it never gets rid of them. There's a giant rootstock that's waiting to spring forward when you just mow. The best thing to do is to kill that rootstock with spot treatment so that then it's gone and you don't have to deal with it every single year.
Okay, I've seen, I'll answer this question. A few people are wondering, you've given so much information, how do you deal with it if you can't remember it all? And so this webinar will be on the Salisbury Forum website within a couple of days, and you'll be able to go to that and watch it, make notes, pause it, do whatever you need. So the information will stay up on our website. And while you're there, you may also want to watch one of Doug Tallamy's previous talks from May of 2017. So is there any this is from Sealy, is there any benefit to having a lot of moss in my yard instead of grass?
Sure, moss is beautiful. It means you've got conditions that favor moss. So that's going to be shadier areas, a lot of moisture. Let nature do what it wants to do. Don't try to force something else there. If moss wants to grow there, I would let it. A lot of people work very hard to get moss, and they find problems getting it. Does moss support a lot of the insects we're talking about? No, but it's a great ground cover, and we have more species of living things in the soil than we do above the soil. And typically leaf litter is the ground cover, but if you have mossy areas on the top, it holds moisture in, and that underground community can thrive underneath moss.
Okay, from Katie, what is the best place to find native plants to buy?
Well, that depends on where you are, and I don't know the best places in Connecticut, but every state has a native plant society, and they do know the best places to get these things. Plus, if you put in buy native plants in your county on Google, places pop up now. Everybody's advertising, and there are more and more places, nurseries that are carrying natives, or specialized nursery that only carry natives. The native plant industry is a growth industry right now. It's kind of going through the roof. So it's easier and easier to get these plants.
Okay, now I have from David Lohr, I've begun transitioning, but my neighbors consider me eccentric. Any suggestions on how to communicate these values to the neighbors, let alone they might consider doing it themselves? Now I might just say, have them go to the Salisbury Forum website and listen to Doug's talks, but Doug, do you have any other suggestions?
Yeah, read my book. That's exactly why I wrote it, because what we're trying to do is change the culture. And for a lot of people, not doing exactly what we used to do makes you a bad citizen, and they don't understand the reasoning behind it. So we're trying to change the culture to the point where the people who do have the big lawn are not the valued citizens anymore. But that takes education, and it's not a soundbite, and that really is why I've written the books that I've written.
Okay, and I mentioned it earlier, but Oblong Books and Music, you can go to their website and order any of Doug's books. So that's a good way to also have those as reference for you or to give as a gift to your neighbor. Now here's a comment from George Massey. Have you noted the number current virtual show Birds in Crisis? What can I do? It's presented by the Salisbury Association, Sharon Audubon, and whoops, it just got out of my vision. I'm not sure where that went. Anyway, it's the Audubon Center and the Salisbury Association have on their website now, because they can't do the exhibition for you to walk into, they have information on bird species, and also you can go to them and learn more about whatever they have there. And let's see, now it's a virtual show. Check Salisbury Association and Sharon Audubon websites. So thank you, George, on that. Now we have
just noticing that I look like a detached head here floating in the darkness because it got dark around me. My wife's outside and I haven't turned on any lights, but my head is attached, so.
Craig Berggren, we're both city and country dwellers. We have 9 acres in the country surrounded by forest land. In New York City, we have a 500 square foot terrace. Which location on a square footage basis would be better served by investing in native plantings?
Well, I would go with the 9 acres because you're trying to create connectivity up there. You're surrounded by a lot of life, but we want to put those plants that are going to maintain it up there. We do want to increase the biodiversity in our cities, but they're never going to be the centers of biodiversity. There's just way too many buildings and cement. So ideally you do it in both places. It'd be fun to see what can actually come to what you would put in your 500 square foot area, but you will, I guarantee, success up on your 9 acres.
Okay, so maybe I'll have one more question, and then we're going to have a couple of questions for our audience to respond to. So Marilyn Anderson, we have a sunny field that is also very, very wet. Are there native trees you'd recommend for a very wet area?
Yeah, trees and bushes. Let's start with the bushes. Buttonbush is a great one for a wet area. Ilex verticillata, winterberry, can grow in standing water. Clethra, sweet pepper bush, it can grow in standing water. And they're all great pollinator plants, great plants for butterflies. So they love those marshy areas. Red maples, that's a tree of the swamp. Pin oak is the oak of the swamp. They all do well in wet areas. River birch also, you don't want that standing in water, but on the edges, these are plants that would normally be near water. So are sycamores. You want to put them in the drier areas on the edge, but they're all great plants.
Well, thank you. So
I'm
Doug,
gonna get up and turn the light on, so I'm not going away.
So now while Doug puts his light on, we're going to have a couple questions pop up for you. Just 2 yes or no questions. If you reply, just click on your answer. I'm just trying to see how this works. And then we will end the poll and return to the final part of our webinar. So I'll give you a moment to look at that and reply. This is quite amazing. We get all kinds of data now from Zoom, and I see, would you join us again for a future webinar? And 100% saying yes, so that's great. Thank you, Doug, for making this successful. All right, so now I'm gonna end the poll.
There we go.
And I just want to thank Doug very much for joining us. Remember, you can buy his books at Oblong Books and Music, and we're delighted that you're here. So anyway, thank you everyone for being with us, and we hope you have a good evening.